The vanished empire. How Europe's most powerful medieval state disappeared overnight. Imagine an empire so wealthy it made kings jealous, so powerful it controlled the fate of Europe, and so magnificent that its court set the standard for luxury across the continent. Map of medieval Europe highlighting Burgundian territories in gold. Now imagine that this empire simply vanished. In less than 24 hours, one of medieval Europe's greatest powers ceased to exist, leaving behind only whispers and legends. Battle scene artwork, then fade to black. This empire controlled the economic heartland of Europe. Its dukes were richer than most kings. Its armies were feared from England to Italy. Yet today, most people have never heard of the Burgundian State, Europe's forgotten superpower that shaped the Renaissance, influenced fashion for centuries, and whose sudden collapse changed the course of Western civilization forever. Visual, title card with dramatic music crescendo. This is the story of how Europe's mightiest medieval empire disappeared overnight, and why its fall still echoes through our world today. ACT 1, The Rise of a Forgotten Empire, 1-330, Visual, medieval French court scene, 14th century artwork. Narrator, our story begins in 1363, not with conquest or revolution, but with a simple royal gift. King John II of France, desperate to secure loyalty during the devastating Hundred Years' War, granted the Duchy of Burgundy to his youngest son, Philip the Bold. It seemed like a minor consolation prize, just another French dukedom among many. Visual, portrait of Philip the Bold, then map showing small Burgundian territory. But Philip had vision that stretched far beyond his modest inheritance. While other nobles spent their wealth on wars and festivities, Philip invested in something revolutionary: marriage alliances that would reshape Europe. Visual, wedding ceremony artwork, then expanding map. In 1369, Philip married Margaret of Flanders, heiress to the wealthiest trading region in medieval Europe. With this single union, the small Duchy of Burgundy suddenly controlled the economic powerhouse of Flanders, home to cities like Bruges and Ghent that generated more wealth than entire kingdoms. Visual, medieval Bruges street scenes, cloth merchants, bustling markets. But Philip's masterstroke wasn't just acquiring territory, it was understanding what made Flanders special. This wasn't farmland or castles. This was the Silicon Valley of the medieval world. Flemish weavers had perfected the art of transforming English wool into the finest cloth in Europe. Merchants from London to Constantinople competed for Flemish textiles. Visual, charts showing trade routes, ships loaded with goods. By 1380, Burgundy controlled the most profitable trade routes in Europe. English wool flowed into Flemish cities, emerged as luxury cloth, then spread across the continent. Every transaction generated taxes for the Burgundian treasury. Within 2 decades, Philip the Bold had transformed his inheritance from a minor French dukedom into Europe's wealthiest state. Visual, Burgundian court scenes, displaying wealth and luxury. The revenues were staggering. While the King of France struggled to fund his armies, the Duke of Burgundy could afford to maintain the most magnificent court in Europe. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that Burgundian banquets made royal feasts look modest by comparison. ACT 2, The Golden Age, 330-745, Visual, portrait of Philip the Good, ornate Burgundian palace. Narrator, Philip the Bold's son, Philip the Good, inherited more than just wealth, he inherited an empire with unlimited potential. Ruling from 1419 to 1467, Philip the Good would transform Burgundy from a rich duchy into a European superpower that kings feared and emperors respected. Visual, map showing massive Burgundian expansion across Low Countries through careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and occasional military pressure. Philip expanded Burgundian control across what we now call Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. But his true genius wasn't territorial, it was political. Visual, diplomatic scenes, treaty signings. While England and France exhausted themselves in the 100 Years' War, Philip the Good played both sides masterfully. He allied with England when it benefited Burgundy, switched to France when circumstances changed, and always ensured that Burgundian interests came first. His territories became neutral ground where enemies could negotiate peace. Visual, The Order of the Golden Fleece ceremony, knights in elaborate robes in 1430, Philip created the Order of the Golden Fleece, Europe's most prestigious chivalric order. Membership in this exclusive brotherhood became the ultimate status symbol. Kings competed for inclusion. The Golden Fleece wasn't just ceremonial, it was political genius. Philip used the order to create personal loyalty bonds with the most powerful nobles across Europe. Visual, Renaissance art, fashion illustrations, court culture scenes, but perhaps Philip's most lasting achievement was Cultural Revolution. The Burgundian court became Europe's trendsetter. Burgundian fashion influenced clothing from London to Rome. Burgundian artists like Jan van Eyck pioneered oil painting techniques that would define Renaissance art. The concept of courtly refinement, of sophisticated noble behavior, was essentially invented in Burgundy. Visual, economic charts, banking scenes, merchant activities economically, Burgundy pioneered systems that wouldn't become common until centuries later. Burgundian merchants developed early forms of international banking. They created standardized currencies that worked across multiple territories. They established trade networks that connected the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. Visual, military formations, armored knights, early firearms. Militarily, Burgundy maintained Europe's most professional army. While other rulers relied on feudal levies and temporary mercenaries, Burgundy employed permanent, well-trained, well-equipped forces. They were among the first to effectively integrate gunpowder weapons with traditional cavalry and infantry. Visual, diplomatic meetings, European court scenes. By 1460, Burgundy had become what political scientists would now call a great power. When European disputes arose, Burgundian mediation was sought. When trade agreements needed negotiation, Burgundian merchants facilitated deals. When military campaigns required funding, Burgundian banks provided credit. The Duke of Burgundy wasn't just another feudal lord, he was effectively an independent sovereign ruling a proto-nation state in the heart of medieval Europe. ACT 3, The Ambitious Dreamer, 745–1030, visual, portrait of Charles the Bold, looking determined and ambitious. Narrator, in 1467, Philip the Good died, leaving his throne to his son Charles. History would remember him as Charles the Bold, though bold in medieval terminology meant reckless rather than brave. Charles inherited the wealthiest, most powerful state in Europe, but for him, that wasn't enough. Charles dreamed of something no one had attempted in centuries, creating a new kingdom. Visual, maps showing the geographic challenge. Burgundian territory split by Lorraine. Charles faced a geographic problem that had frustrated his predecessors. Burgundian territories were split into two main blocks, the original Burgundy in the south and the wealthy Low Countries in the north, separated by the independent Duchy of Lorraine. Charles became obsessed with connecting these territories into one continuous kingdom. Visual, battle scenes, siege warfare. His first target was Lorraine itself. In 1475, Charles invaded, captured Nancy, and installed a puppet ruler. But this aggressive expansion alarmed his neighbors. King Louis XI of France, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III, and the Swiss Confederacy began forming coalitions to contain Burgundian power. Visual, Louis XI of France, looking cunning and calculating. Louis XI of France, known as the Spider King for his web of political intrigue, was particularly concerned. A unified Burgundian kingdom would surround France on two sides and potentially challenge French dominance forever. Louis began secretly funding Charles's enemies while publicly maintaining peaceful relations. Visual, Swiss pikemen formations, Alpine battle scenes. Charles's greatest miscalculation was underestimating the Swiss. The Swiss Confederacy had developed revolutionary military tactics, disciplined pike formations that could devastate traditional knightly cavalry. When Charles attempted to expand into Swiss territory, he encountered something unprecedented, a military system that made Burgundian advantages irrelevant. Visual, Battle of Grandson, Swiss victory scenes at the Battle of Grandson in 1476, Swiss pikemen routed Charles's army so completely that the Burgundians abandoned their entire camp, including Charles's personal treasure. The defeat was shocking. Burgundy's professional military, considered Europe's finest, had been humiliated by Swiss citizen soldiers. Visual, Charles regrouping, preparing for another campaign. Rather than recognizing the changing nature of European warfare, Charles became more determined. He rebuilt his army, recruited additional mercenaries, and prepared for a final campaign to establish his kingdom. His advisors urged caution, but Charles's vision of royal status had become an obsession. Visual, winter 1476, army preparing for siege. In late 1476, Charles launched his most ambitious campaign, the reconquest of Lorraine and the siege of Nancy. It was winter, his army was exhausted from previous defeats, and his enemies were closing in from all sides. But Charles pressed forward, convinced that one decisive victory would secure his dream of kingship. ACT 4, The Sudden Fall. Visual, snowy battlefield, January 5, 1477, dawn-breaking narrator, January 5, 1477. Outside the walls of Nancy, Charles the Bold prepared for the battle that would either establish his kingdom or destroy everything his family had built over a century. He commanded approximately 8,000 men, a mixture of Burgundian knights, Italian mercenaries, and German infantry. Visual, combined army approaching. Swiss, Lorrainers, French allies approaching. Through the winter morning was a coalition army of Swiss pikemen, Lorraine patriots, and French allies, roughly 20,000 strong. They had been maneuvering for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Visual, battle formation, tactical movements. The battle began with what seemed like a Burgundian advantage. Charles's cavalry charged the coalition flanks while his artillery bombarded their center. For the first hour, Burgundian tactical superiority appeared decisive. Visual, Swiss pike formations advancing, battle turning. But then the Swiss pikes advanced. These weren't medieval peasants with farm tools, these were disciplined soldiers wielding 18-foot steel-tipped pikes in perfectly coordinated formations. Burgundian heavy cavalry, the backbone of medieval warfare, proved helpless against these moving walls of steel. Visual, battle chaos, Burgundian army collapsing within 3 hours. The Burgundian army had collapsed completely. Mercenaries fled. Knights abandoned their positions. Charles himself led a desperate final charge, hoping personal valor might salvage victory from disaster. Visual, Charles's death scene, body being discovered. Charles the Bold died as he had lived, boldly, recklessly, and ultimately futilely. His body was discovered 3 days later, frozen in a ditch, stripped of armor and identifying marks. The man who had dreamed of founding a new royal dynasty died anonymously in a muddy field. Visual, map showing immediate territorial collapse. With Charles's death, the Burgundian state faced immediate existential crisis. He left no male heir, only his daughter Mary, barely 19 years old and untested in politics. Within days of the Nancy defeat, French armies invaded southern Burgundy while local rebellions erupted across the Low Countries. Visual, Mary of Burgundy, looking young and overwhelmed. Mary of Burgundy inherited what remained of Europe's greatest medieval empire, but she inherited it at the moment of its greatest vulnerability. The institutional structures that had made Burgundy powerful, professional armies, diplomatic networks, financial systems, all depended on ducal authority that had suddenly vanished. ACT 5, The Lasting Impact. Visual, hasty wedding ceremony. Mary and Maximilian. Narrator, within months, Mary of Burgundy made the decision that would determine Europe's future for centuries. Unable to defend her inheritance alone, she married Maximilian of Habsburg, heir to the Holy Roman Empire. This marriage alliance preserved Burgundian independence, but at a devastating cost. Visual, map showing territorial division. France immediately seized the original Duchy of Burgundy, incorporating it permanently into the French kingdom. The wealthy Low Countries passed to the Habsburgs through Mary's marriage. Within a generation, these territories would become the Spanish Netherlands, setting the stage for centuries of conflict. Visual: Spanish Habsburg Empire map through Maximilian and Mary's son, the future Emperor Charles V. Burgundian territories became part of the largest empire in European history, Spanish Habsburg domains that stretched from the Netherlands to Sicily, from Peru to the Philippines. The economic systems developed in Burgundy financed Spanish colonization of the Americas. Visual: art galleries, fashion evolution, cultural influences. Culturally, Burgundy's influence proved even more enduring than its political power. Burgundian artistic traditions continued through Dutch and Flemish masters. Burgundian concepts of courtly behavior influenced European aristocracy for centuries. Even today, the idea of sophisticated European culture traces much of its origin to 15th-century Burgundian courts. Visual: modern Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. The territories that formed the Burgundian heartland, modern Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, retained distinct identities that ultimately led to their independence from larger empires. The Low Countries' experience of autonomous governance under Burgundian rule created political traditions that survived foreign domination. Visual: European Union buildings, modern integration. Remarkably, the economic integration that Burgundy pioneered in the 15th century anticipated modern European Union concepts by 500 years. Standardized currencies, free movement of goods and people, coordinated foreign policies, all were Burgundian innovations now implemented across contemporary Europe. Visual: historical textbooks, university classes. But why is this extraordinary story so unknown? The answer reveals how history gets written by winners. France absorbed southern Burgundy and preferred to emphasize royal centralization rather than autonomous duchies. Spain controlled northern territories and focused on imperial rather than regional narratives. The Burgundian state existed independently for barely a century, leaving few institutional structures to preserve its memory. Visual: archaeological discoveries, historical research. Only recently have historians recognized Burgundy's true significance. Archaeological evidence reveals economic sophistication that surpassed contemporary kingdoms. Diplomatic records show political influence that extended from Scotland to Italy. Court documents describe cultural innovations that shaped European civilization. Visual: Battle of Nancy Memorial, modern commemoration. Today, a simple memorial marks the spot where Charles the Bold fell outside Nancy. Few visitors understand that they're standing at the location where one of Europe's most remarkable political experiments ended. In less than 24 hours, a state that had taken over a century to build simply vanished from European politics. Visual: panoramic view of modern Europe. Narrator: the Burgundian state's rise and fall offers profound lessons about power, ambition, and the unpredictable nature of historical change. It reminds us that today's great powers were once unimaginable, and tomorrow's dominant forces may be emerging in unexpected places. Visual: fade to closing graphics. Most importantly, it proves that some of history's most fascinating stories remain hidden, waiting for curious minds to rediscover them. The next time you see a map of medieval Europe, remember the empire that once controlled its economic heart and disappeared overnight. Visual: end screen with suggested videos and subscription prompt. What other forgotten empires shaped our world? Let me know in the comments which historical mysteries you'd like explored next. And if you enjoyed uncovering Europe's lost superpower, subscribe for more hidden stories from our past. The Vanished Empire. Subscribe for more hidden history.